a big lecture course, or is it a seminar? Oh, okay, yeah. So it's manageable. You can still have discussion, yeah. Right? Yeah. It's going by so fast. Yeah. But it's great. I mean, the colloquiums are just amazing. Yeah. Very inspiring. Yeah. All the time. There's events, dinners. I can't do it. Yeah, it's amazing how like a hub. I mean, I've never experienced a fellowship like this in the sense that it's, you know, where living consultants you just meet other living people. But here it's, you know, artists, sociologists, philosophers, independent, scholars. It gives you this whole different perspective. Makes you feel gravity too, in the sense of like, you should do, you should do different. But it's fun. Will you be able to come to the lunch? Oh, great. I don't know what we'll have. So it's always good. Is it easy for you to come to get here? Oh, you do? Oh. Pretty easy. Right. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, the first thing that struck me, I have a 2-year-old daughter, so the first thing that struck me was that it had the world's only Curious George store. She loves that. Doesn't it say Henry James that he wants a plaque around Washington Square to mark where he was born? Something like that. just a wooden square kind of thing. And every morning to bring my daughter to bed, we pass by the William James house. It's so uncanny.
Hi there.
Yeah, really. Oh, you think about that sometimes when you're walking? Yeah. Absolutely.
Microphone.
Thanks.
It can go in your belt and pocket.
Okay. This?
Yep. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. This weekend, I'm going to Lowell, the birthplace of Kerouac, because on March 12th is his birthday, so they're doing like a birthday celebration. And so the editor of The Unknown Kerouac, Todd Teachin, and I are going to give a little thing, and then we're going to go on a Kerouac tour. So I always think about that pilgrimaging to the sites.
Hello, hello. Krista. Hi. Wasn't Angelique great?
Yes, she was.
So you are having a workshop today? Never had a dinner with Sharika. Hey, how are you? How's the baby? Oh my God. How's the big O doing? Good. Grandma said hi.
Hey, Skip. Finally, it arrived, signed by both Brent and I for
Oh,
you,
thank you.
at long last. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Amiable with big teeth. All right, boss. No. Yeah, we'll let him pick. All right, so the Anticosta. Yeah, pretty much. It's a visitation. It's a sign. I looked up, thought I was having a drug flashback to the late 60s and early 1970s. That's my dear friend Cornell.
Lovely, great African civilization. That's what I'm just
Martin Kilson left me a long voicemail message. That was so beautiful.
It's so beautiful.
Thank you.
We'll get you.
Thank you. Remind me, just say, when we finish, there's something I wanted to tell you, a story. All right? All right, we ready to go? All right, go ahead, take it away. You know the drill. Krishna. She was once my graduate student. Like Abby.
Okay, welcome to today's colloquium. Before we start, I have a couple of announcements to make. There will not be a colloquium next week because of spring break.
Yay, spring break.
On March 22nd, we will recommence with Gaitra Bahadur speaking on Brotherhood of the Boat, African Americans in Guyana, 1970-1989. Also that week, we will have a three-part Cohen lecture series delivered by Jacqueline Francis, who's at the California College of the Arts, and she will speak on Real Talk, Why the History of Art and Visual Cultural Studies Matter. Now please welcome to the podium Anita Patterson, Professor of English at Boston University.
Thank you. I'm very, very happy to be back here with friends at the Spring Colloquium and to introduce today's speaker. Professor Jean-Christophe Cloutier is in the Department of English at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his PhD in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia University, an MA from SUNY Buffalo, and a BA in Liberal Arts and English from Concordia University in Montreal. At Columbia, Professor Cloutier also interned as an archivist in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where he processed the papers of the publisher Samuel Roth, who had kept Claude McKay's unpublished, previously unknown manuscript of his last novel, Amiable with Big Teeth. Professor Cloutier's important new scholarly edition of McKay's novel, produced in collaboration with Brent Edwards, will have a significant impact on our understanding of McKay's late career, the international politics of the Harlem Renaissance, and the development of modernism during the interwar period. Among his other publications, Professor Cloutier's article, The Comic Book World of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which appeared in Novel, explores how Ellison's allusions to the comic book culture of the Cold War and revisionary engagement with modernist mythical method allow him to portray the violence and heroism of Harlem life, as well as the urban nimbleness and adaptability necessary for future leadership. He has also brought to light the illuminating complexity of Jack Kerouac's French-Canadian ethnic background as editor of Kerouac's original French writings and translator of Kerouac's two French novellas in The Unknown Kerouac. Professor Cloutier's work has been featured in the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Huffington Post, Modernism Modernity, Cinema Journal, and elsewhere. The title of his talk today is Claude McKay's Archival Rebirth, Provenance and Politics in Amiable with Big Teeth. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jean-Christophe Cloutier.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you for that generous introduction and for taking the time to do this. I also want to thank Skip Gates for all his support and help in making the publication possible of Amiable with Big Teeth. I want to thank Krishna, Justin, everybody at the Hutchins, and of course my fellows. It's been an honor and a privilege to get to know you and your work. Very inspiring. Okay, so to start us off today, I'd like to appeal to the master of horror, none other than Stephen King, and open with a little something from The Shining. the 1977 novel, not the movie, because the novel, unlike the film, is about the archive. In the book, a few days after settling in with his wife and son, Jack Torrance, who has been newly hired as the caretaker of the isolated and snowbound Overlook Hotel, stumbles upon countless stacks of moldy papers in the basement boiler room of the hotel. Even though he has a slew of tasks to attend to, Torrance simply cannot wrest himself away from the dusty piles. More than cabin fever, he is gripped by what could best be called, via Jacques Derrida, archive fever. Frantically looking through the papers, Torrance begins to find, quote, gaps in the piled newspapers and records, and realizes that, quote, there was history here, all right, and not just in newspaper headlines. It was buried between the entries in these ledgers and account books and room service chits where you couldn't quite see it. In 1922, Warren G. Harding had ordered a whole salmon at 10 o'clock in the evening and a case of Coors beer. But whom had he been eating and drinking with? Had it been a poker game, a strategy session? What? Jack glanced at his watch and was surprised to see that 45 minutes had somehow slipped since he had come down here. His hands and arms were grimy, and he probably smelled bad. He walked slowly between the mountains of paper, his mind alive and ticking over possibilities in a speedy way that was exhilarating. He hadn't felt this way in years. It suddenly seemed that the book he had semi-jokingly promised himself might really happen. It might even be right here, buried in these untidy heaps of paper. It could be a work of fiction or history or both. Of course, we all know what happens after that. Jack Torrance not only fails to write a book, but he tries to murder his entire family instead. Well, I guess we've all been there. Or I have anyway. Although not all of the authors in my project showed this predilection for archive-induced homicide, they did all forge their novels in the boiler room of their own collected records and filing cabinets. And the writer I'll be speaking about today, Claude McKay, had a similar renewed sense of purpose as Jack Torrance does in the scene I just read, when the special research work and record building he was doing as part of the Federal Writers Program gave him a new lease on life. An FWP writer from 1936 to 1939, McKay contributed a significant amount of research and spent considerable time consulting the work of his colleagues, activities that led him to feel that the book he had promised himself might really happen. And yet McKay struggled, like Torrance, between fiction or history or both. In fact, McKay eventually wrote two books. First, A History of Harlem, Harlem Negro Metropolis, published in 1940, and the last of his books published in his lifetime. And then a fiction. But for over half a century, no one had had the chance to realize that. Until the recovery of his recently published novel, the long, mummified Amiable with Big Teeth, composed in 1941. For my colloquium this afternoon, I'd like to share with you two intertwined stories around the notion of McKay's archival rebirth, as my title states. On the one hand, how the archive's recuperative power can induce a belated rebirth via posthumous publication, posthumous literally meaning born after death, and also how McKay's own archival practices in his late career led him to return to prose fiction for the first time in close to a decade. The idea of archival rebirth emerges out of my project's abiding interest in the theories and manuals written by archivists themselves, a profession that I realized was largely being ignored by literary scholars, even though so many of us are always bringing up the archive. As I dove into the history of archival science, especially over the 20th century, I was gripped by what has become a dominant metaphor at the heart of archival practice, the life cycle of documents concept. Introduced in North America in 1956 by archivist Theodore Schellenberg, in his groundbreaking manual, Modern Archives, the concept is a means of understanding records and documents and their provenance and use and how their final destiny is handled. The model, quote, indicates that records are not static, but have a life similar to that of biological organisms. They are born, live through youth and old age, and then die. Most models aim to show a progression of actions taken at different times in the life of a record. Typically, it's creation, capture, storage, use, and disposal. This is a graph here kind of showing that model. Capture, in this context, refers to the actions that are taken to secure a record into an effective records management system, where the record can be maintained and made accessible for as long as it is needed. But I don't have time to get into it right now, but I just want to suggest how unusual such a model can look from a different disciplinary perspective. When you look at the graph from another context, say from the context of a scholar interested in African American history, the model takes on disturbing, uncomfortable connotations: creation, capture, storage and maintenance, use and disposal, right? The institution of slavery seems to be kind of another way of looking at this model. But I can't table that for now. The life cycle model, despite some important critiques, has largely been embraced by the archiving profession. In fact, the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration Agency, or NARA for short, even offers up a simplified version of the model on its website. Here, go to the link. Well, I've got the link on my laptop, but it's not showing that. But anyway, you can see that it's part of their series on the ABCs about archives. What's an archive? What's an archivist? Those kinds of information here. Sorry, let me just get back to my, okay. They show you at the bottom here, records have life cycles, and then they kind of show you the steps. Roughly speaking, first a record is created, usually for a specific purpose, presumably for a legitimate reason, and according to certain standards. The record is then active, what archivists call maximum primary value. Once this initial activity is no longer necessary, its primary purpose achieved, it usually develops a related use, something like consultation, and is still kept on site, but might not be used every day. After a time, the record creator must decide how to dispose of the record, a phase often called appraisal. Should it be destroyed, or do we deem it to have, quote, long-term indefinite archival value and thus store it for posterity? Once stored or archived, the record acquires what some archivists call secondary value, a concept that was developed in order to distinguish between the types of purposes and contexts in which a record is first created and used, and then the new kinds of uses that the same record can unpredictably take on, continued or alternate uses. Some archivists refer to this secondary value as a second life cycle, a kind of afterlife akin to a secular resurrection. Interestingly, it seems this supplemental value is always latent. A record may lie dormant indefinitely until it is suddenly brought back to life by a new administration, a wandering scholar, an accidental traveler. Of course, bringing the dead back to life always has a Frankensteinian touch of the monstrous. Some Christians, perhaps, might say it partakes of the divine, but the literary-minded can't forget Mary Shelley or Penny Dreadfuls for long, which is why I believe that horror as a genre is most fitted to help us understand archival science and theory. And why I opened with Stephen King's The Shining, because it literalizes archival science's dominant model. The hotel's specters come back to life via the human contact with its archive. Okay, so this was perhaps a long way of introducing you to some of the basic concepts animating my overall project, and to help contextualize what I mean by Claude McKay's archival rebirth. The talk will combine both what we might call the fruits of archival labor, so regular scholarship, the fragments that we shore against our ruins, alongside a sharing of my process or methodology involved in such harvesting. The book I'm working on, from which this talk emerges, will consciously follow a hybrid format, a similar hybrid format. In other words, in addition to investigative chapters buttressed by archival evidence, I will intersperse narrative accounts of archival visits, offering a wide array of representational scenarios confronting contemporary archival researchers. In doing this, my hope is to convey yet another layer of the ways in which an archival journey, with its treasures, its mysteries, and its disappointments, can hijack thinking and thrust you into the unexpected. And here I have in mind the way James Baldwin defines a journey, as quoted in the opening minutes of Raoul Peck's documentary, I Am Not Your Negro. Quote, I am saying that a journey is called that because you cannot know what you will discover on the journey, what you will do with what you find, or what you find will do to you. So let's begin where it all began, namely where everything is already over, an archive. In the summer of 2009, just before my third year as a doctoral student in the Department of English and Comp Lit at Columbia, I took a job as an archival intern and began processing the papers of the notorious Jewish-American 20th century writer, publisher, and recidivist jailbird Samuel Roth in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library. About a month into the job, I came upon a typescript labeled Amiable with Big Teeth, a novel of the love affair between the communists and the poor black sheep of Harlem by Claude McKay, author of Home to Harlem. It was with disbelief that I looked upon the bound typescript's title page. As a student of 20th century American literature who had, rather serendipitously perhaps, recently written a seminar paper on Home to Harlem, encountering this typescript was both tremendously exciting and highly suspect. Was the novel truly written by the renowned Jamaican-born poet, novelist, and scholar Claude McKay? And if so, what could it possibly be doing in the papers of Samuel Roth? That all-around schemer who is perhaps best known for being the appellant in a notorious 1957 Supreme Court obscenity case, following his conviction for mailing obscene materials, and his status as the target of James Joyce's famous 1927 international protest, a petition signed by 167 writers, artists, and intellectuals for publishing unauthorized excerpts of James Joyce's Ulysses in the United States. And in fact, in 1934, when Random House finally published Ulysses in the States, they used Roth's unauthorized edition as the model. So it was actually Samuel Roth's status as this villain of modernism that prompted me to process his papers in the first place when I began the internship. The material in the Roth collection was semi-arranged, having been first transferred for transportation to Columbia from Roth's apartment into 53 transitional document boxes and 5 record cartons to facilitate access. Despite the transfers, the material was kept in the order in which they had been found prior to donation. Except for a few letters arranged alphabetically by the Roth family, the majority of the material had no discernible order. And so I began the slow, meticulous process of cataloging the collection. It was only when I undertook the actual filing of material in the writings series that I first took hold of the Amiable typescript, which was ensconced in a deteriorating black-colored binder with floppy covers. And on the back had this property of Sam Roth. Roth used the same kind of DIY binder for many of the manuscripts in his possession. So from a visual standpoint, it didn't look like much of anything else. It looked like most of the majority of the writings in the collection. Nothing to make it stand out, in other words. I returned home and began rummaging through library databases, the internet at large, and my own McKay books for references to Amiable. The searches were all unsuccessful. There was no mention of this title or any such manuscript either in McKay's published work or in the secondary scholarship on his career by critics and biographers like Wayne Cooper, Winston James, Tyrone Tillery, or William Maxwell. Increasingly excited, I temporarily abandoned my processing of the writings series to look through the correspondence boxes, which you're not supposed to do when you're processing. There, astonished and delighted, I found 2 letters from Claude McKay to Roth, as well as a book contract between McKay and Roth, but for a book titled Descent into Harlem, which I'll talk about more soon. The initial rush of discovery, however, was tempered by my knowledge that Roth had hired ghostwriters to compose fake sequels to modern classics, such as Lady Chatterley's Husbands, or Lady Chatterley's Sisters, and works falsely attributed to famous authors such as My Sister and I by Friedrich Nietzsche, which was a sensational hoax in which a repentant Friedrich Nietzsche confesses to years of incestuous love with his sister Elizabeth and ultimately disavows the allegiance to the Übermensch to follow, of all things, the teachings of Jesus.
Roth is amazing. To spur sales, Roth had used all sorts of gimmicks, like skin-edge microblades, the sharpest razors imaginable, or buy this book and get, a manual that teaches you how to drink and stay sober. Or for the especially forlorn and lonely on his subscribers list, he offered 3-foot-high blow-up replicas of women, living dolls that came dressed or undressed and in 3 choices of hair color. That's right. So in short, the specter of Roth, right, his salesmanship and forgeries loomed over the discovery. But the byline by Claude McKay, author of Home to Harlem, on the title page, the letters McKay sent to Roth, and the book contract all warranted further investigation. After a week or so of additional research that resulted in nothing more substantive than a short list of individuals that both men may have had in common, such as Max Eastman, Frank Harris, Louise Bryant, Maxwell Bodenheim, and others, I decided to share the discovery with Brent Hayes-Edwards, a leading McKay expert, who also happened to be my dissertation advisor at the time, and with whom I eventually co-edited the novel. So I shared with him the few preliminary findings I made, and to be honest, I do remember thinking, I bet he already knows about this, because, Brent seems to know everything, right? Yeah. But he hadn't heard of it. So we decided to make a copy of the novel to see what we really had on our hands. Right? This is before we had even read it. The novel's presence in the Roth papers was at once indisputable and inexplicable. Instead of making things clear, as at first it seemed they might, the other McKay materials in the Roth papers only added to our confusion. There was a book contract, yes, but it was for something called Descent into Harlem, not Amiable with Big Teeth. The contract is actually a ghostwriting job. It stipulates that although Descent would be written by Claude McKay, its author would publicly be known as Dante Cachici. The contract says that McKay was also supposed to provide an introduction, but this time under his own name. The letters make it clear that Descent into Harlem was meant to be a first-person account of an Italian immigrant living in Harlem, a conceit clearly different than what we have in Amiable with Big Teeth. So there was also another puzzling element. Roth had bound the typescript with a proem, this thing called proem, written in a very different voice and composed on a visibly different typeface from the rest of the novel. The proem is 3 pages long. It's written in the broken English of a young Italian-American coming back from years spent abroad and going to Harlem to search for his family. Right, like you can see at the end of my junior year, I quit the high school, right? It was presumably written by Cachici or Roth as an example of what he had in mind for Descent into Harlem. And yes, Cachici is a real person. He wrote the afterword to Roth's 1947 novel, Bum Rap, the story of a male virgin. Here's the title page, right? He began kissing her toes. And here's an ad for Bum Rap, a novel of incredible richness, the most amusing I've read since Don Quixote, writes Norman Lockridge. But of course, Norman Lockridge is Samuel Roth. It was just another one of his pseudonyms that he used. After the international protest, he often was able to get famous modernists to help him out and contribute by pretending to be Norman Lockridge. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a cartoon that was included with Cachici's afterward. Cachici and Roth probably met in jail. They were both doing jail time in the 30s. Cachici had the counterfeited $10 bills, and Roth, of course, was mailing obscene materials. As far as Brent and I have been able to determine, however, even though the contract was signed by McKay, Roth, and Cachici, the Descent into Harlem project was never realized. In fact, one of Roth's checks to McKay bounced, which greatly distressed the nearly penniless McKay at the time. In a letter to Roth dated October 6th, McKay writes, it's kind of at the bottom of the letter here, any incident like a returned check upsets me in a way that perhaps I can never explain to you. It has never happened to me before, although I have had terribly difficult times. But you must know that Harlem is just a little village. A thing like that is whispered around, and I have enemies.
More important is the fact that I do my writing on a very delicate balance, and an incident like this will upset me for many days. I heard about it on Saturday night. Sunday, I remained worried, and all of today I had to give to it. Right? Yeah, right. Isn't that an amazing letter? So, while we were somewhat perplexed by the ancillary documents in the Roth papers, one of our initial assumptions early on was that Descent into Harlem and Amiable with Big Teeth could perhaps be the same project, that McKay had started writing Descent for Roth, but then it somehow morphed or transformed into something very different during the creative process. Whatever the mysteries of its composition, we were both excited by Amiable with Big Teeth. We were struck by the many circumstantial clues that McKay might indeed have written it. There were some telltale quirks, for example, the predilection for the one word Afro-American, which is like a McKay touch, as well as a preponderance of themes familiar to any reader of McKay's later work: labor agitation in Harlem, which is much of what the novel's about, black internationalism, anti-communism. Now, these clues were admittedly circumstantial, but it was also hard to imagine who else, even among black writers in Harlem in the period, could have written this novel. So we decided to contact the McKay estate, telling them of the discovery and outlining our preliminary sense of the Provenance, and we requested permission to bring the novel to publication. After consulting with a outside legal advisor, however, the estate was not yet ready to confirm the authenticity of Amiable. Given the fact that no one had ever heard of this novel, they understandably wanted irrefutable evidence. So although this roadblock was admittedly frustrating initially, it spurred us into many months of research in archives around the country, eventually giving us not only overwhelming evidence of the typescript's authenticity, as we explain in the introduction to the novel, but also a much fuller understanding of the history of the novel and of McKay's late career. We eventually came to realize that Amiable had already been written by the time McKay entered into that contract with Roth, and perhaps even before the two men even met. In the end, quite apart from our earliest assumptions, Roth had nothing whatsoever to do with the novel's composition. We still don't and may never know exactly why and how Samuel Roth became the custodian of McKay's typescript. We can only conjecture that McKay gave the manuscript to Roth to read, probably in the late summer or early fall of '41, thus shortly after the publisher E.P. Dutton, who had contracted McKay to write Amiable, as we discovered, declined to publish it. It may have been a way to fulfill the contract. The mystery remains as to why Roth never returned the typescript to its author, and why Roth himself seems to have forgotten that he had it. He died in '74. McKay's death in 1948 may have reminded Roth that he had the manuscript in his files, since, as we explain in the edition's note on the text, also originally bound with the black binder with the Amiable typescript was this one-page publisher's note, presumably written by Roth. This note is in a different typeface from the novel itself again, and is often factually incorrect. For example, it states that McKay wrote the novel just before his death, whereas in fact our research proves conclusively that he composed it in the spring of 1941. It's likely that Roth composed a note at some point after McKay's death in 1948 in the hope of releasing the book posthumously in order to capitalize on the fame the writer of the note describes as Harlem's most distinguished novelist. But for unknown reasons, his plans never materialized, and the typescript would go on to gather more dust for another half a century. So in retrospect, the initial discovery and subsequent authentication was an education in the need to remain vigilant when encountering these ever-seductive material traces of the past. Some of the ghosts in the Roth papers were deceptive, telling us to follow false trails until we doubled back to the novel and began again. It quickly became apparent that the archive can lie just as easily as fiction, and can in fact lie much better because of its fancy archival clothing. It reminded me that more often than we might initially suspect, both genuine and inauthentic documents are literally bound together, like the garden in Vladimir Nabokov's Ada, with its real and fake flowers mixed together. Or to remain with Amiable with Big Teeth, like Lige Alamaya's own imperial letter, which I'll get to. And the best means of distinguishing between the two was to try and trace documents back to the beginning, provenance is always key. The research journey we undertook allowed us to determine the exact provenance of the novel, when McKay conceived of the project, when and where he composed it, which publisher paid him to write it, etc. But the research journey that the novel had unlocked paved the way for a whole array of new discoveries. The more I learned about the novel's provenance, the more it began to speak back to the archive and to a whole buried history lying within it, a history that McKay had helped to build and out of which he had composed the novel. So we could call McKay's Amiable with Big Teeth Mackay's shadow book, to use a term coined by poet and now director of the Schoenberg Center, Kevin Young, a term that fellow John Jennings also referred to in his talk a few weeks ago. Young gives three possible types of shadow books: the unwritten, the removed, which is that which has been taken out of books, and the lost. Only the third is actually complete. It is written, yet is now gone, Young writes. But in the strange case of Amiable, since we did not know that it had been written in the first place, its loss could ironically only be felt after it was found. Yet its subsequent emergence from the shadow realm suddenly helped explain a lot of questions that remained latent about his papers and about the final decade of his life. All right, so now I get to part two of the talk. To start part two, let me go back to the idea of life cycles of documents for a moment. As I said, this is a novel whose unexpected discovery necessitated a long process of authentication, which entailed years of rummaging through multiple repositories to find scraps of documentary evidence proving that McKay had written the novel. But naturally, none of the documents we found and used had been created with the use of authentication in mind. In other words, authentication is a process that bestows documents with a new life or value. And one must remember that use value is the ultimate operative principle at the heart, operating at the heart of archival science. That's what determines the arc of life cycles, a document's primary and secondary value. A researcher's project inevitably reorganizes the hierarchy of a document's value, and thus always speaks to the politics of the archive. The mutability of what is considered valuable is at the heart of my project. And the possibility of a document's afterlife or continued unpredictable alternative uses in posterity lies at the heart of the life cycle concept and the archival profession as a whole. As a literary scholar, I'm particularly interested in how the existence of a novel can be the cause behind a necessary reorganization of values, a recalibration of the materiality we preserve and use to reconstruct our histories. Novelists like McKay perform an alternative parallel function of appraisal, the process of determining, quote, whether documentary materials have sufficient value to warrant acquisition or preservation. These serve to destabilize and interrogate the configurations of archival institutionalization. Other practices, such as scrapbooking or collecting, can serve an analogous function, but the novelist, as archivist, is in dialectical tension with his own time's ruling ideology and his or her unique sense of posterity, allowing fiction to become, quote, active in the shaping of events, to quote Ralph Ellison. Part of what is most astonishing to me in this particular case, however, is that McKay's novel constantly stages scenes where evidentiary challenges surrounding authentication become a prime concern in the narrative. In fact, I would argue that most major plot points in the novel hinge on testing the authenticity of documents and people, on questioning and clarifying declarations of fact, and of how to act in the face of fraud, propaganda, and fake news. I'll elaborate this during this second half, and I'll first give you two small examples of related moments that appear throughout the novel, just to give you an idea. One of the heroes of the book, Professor Kouase, is a bibliophile who also collects African artifacts, something like Professor Gates. And as soon as this character is presented with the opportunity to meet a native Ethiopian, Liege Tekla Alamaya, he asks whether the latter would be willing to authenticate some of the objects in his collection. Factual authentication is also raised by an extended observation about a popular Harlem bar's guest book, a document filled with, quote, a series of exciting international signatures. Rather than simply including the logbook as material proof of Harlem's international reach, McKay goes on to say that in the neighborhood, there was a rumor that many of the signatures in the book were fake. In other words, McKay always seems to present the potential unreliability of archival records as an inherent threat to the kinds of histories we can confidently write. Taking all this into consideration, then, the authenticating research I was doing in the real world thus had fascinating resonances with the concerns and challenges both in the novel and with those McKay was facing at the time of its composition. Equipped with the knowledge of what McKay had been able to produce as a novelist, the research process was like entering into his writerly workshop, seeing the pieces that he'd gathered and transformed to craft the novel. To use an analogy inspired by Harry Allen's breathtaking Colloquium from a couple of weeks ago, Amiable suddenly stood out as a remix of everything McKay had been working on at the time as a journalist, a scholar, an activist. And the research allowed me to deconstruct every track that made up the novel's song, and hearing them individually and separately, realizing the extent of the craft and the ethical choices behind McKay's aesthetic. It was also becoming clear that though McKay had formerly been a writer who prided himself on always keeping politics out of his art, this time he had been unable or unwilling to do so. And this new politicized trajectory was directly related to the archives he was gathering and the research he was doing. In other words, I could trace the politicization of McKay's late career as it relates to his archival strategies as a novelist. In my project as a whole, I remain interested in following the vagabond itineraries of documents. And in this case, I wanted to understand what was at stake for McKay as a Black intellectual and novelist, and reflect on what alternative facts, to use the infamous phrase, do in the novel form. As my research shows, despite McKay's investment in factual accuracy, he litters his novel with forgeries. The problem was figuring out why. The novel both empowers the Black community, yet challenges our assumptions about material truths, giving rise to what Anne Laura Stoller terms epistemic uncertainties. Ultimately, I'd like to suggest that late McKay's archival sensibility is shaped by his ideals of Black self-reliance, rather than by a strict adherence to historical truth. In this respect, the political, imaginative, and archival are for him intertwined and fair game, since all forms of media manipulate information in the first place. Amiable with Big Teeth demonstrates how a novel can outperform the archive's forensic task to tell a story of the past event that remains otherwise unknown or inexplicable. Or, as McKay observed in his working notes, behind the headlines lies the real throbbing life of Harlem. All right. By 1941, the year he wrote Amiable, the joint failure of international communism and the rise of fascism in Europe posed an immediate threat to what McKay considered an overly credulous African-American minority lacking in leadership. And as a result, the novel is extremely political. As such, it marks a sharp shift in McKay's style as a novelist. For most of his career, McKay was clear about his allegiance to the aesthetic over the political, explaining his position in his 1937 memoir, A Long Way From Home. And in any work of art, my natural reaction was more for its intrinsic beauty than for its social significance. My social sentiments were strong, definite, and radical, but I kept them separate from my aesthetic emotions. The two are different and should not be mixed up. Yet by the time he wrote Amiable, McKay seems to have forced his aesthetic hand to adopt a more mixed approach. In a letter to Max Eastman discussing his progress on Amiable, McKay confesses that his arduous archival research has affected his novelistic practice. I took your advice halfway and spent a month, not two, pottering with the plot, characters, and aim of the novel. And it has worked out a little differently from the first draft I showed you. The main thing is that it has some politics in it, and we had thought it expedient to keep politics out. But after building up Deleuze to a really sympathetic character, albeit weak, and consulting notes and newspaper stories of the period, early 1936, in which the tale begins, I discovered that it was impossible to keep politics out, for the aid to Ethiopia was the jumping off of the Popular Front movement in the United States. Of course, I'm keeping the political stuff in its proper place so that it may not be a handicap to the straight tale. So, after spending time on problems of plot and characters, McKay admits that his own research notes and clippings have made it impossible to keep politics out of the novel. So while he may still feel that matters of social significance must be kept separate from his aesthetic emotions rather than be mixed up, this segregation, so to speak, of radical politics and aesthetic sense proves untenable in his late post-FWP novelistic practice. I'm not saying that McKay ends up betraying his own aesthetic sense with politics, but rather that his maturation as a novelist and scholar now allows for the political to have a rightful place in his aesthetic. Although I don't have time to outline in detail the multitude of plot points and characters in Amiable that are derived from historical antecedents outlined in his notebooks and in Harlem Negro Metropolis, I want to quickly point to a few in order to give you a clearer sense of what he's doing. The novel, I should say, is set in 1936 Harlem and is concerned with the efforts of various factions to support the cause of Ethiopia, the independent black nation that was then at war with Mussolini's imperial Italian forces. Among the leading characters involved are an Ethiopian envoy, Lish Tekle Alamaya, whose name is strikingly reminiscent of Prince Alamayu that Christiane Crouch discussed in her wonderful colloquium. Yeah, he's there. Something I hadn't realized beforehand. Alamaya is also based on real Ethiopian envoys that McKay had met. This is a picture of two of them that is included in Harlem Negro Metropolis. There's also Pablo Peixoto, a middle-aged former boss in a numbers game, now turned legitimate businessman and philanthropist, who's kind of loosely based on Casper Holstein, who was played by Jeffrey Wright in Boardwalk Empire. There's also the collector and historian Professor Kwase, based on Willis Huggins and Charles Seifert. And there's the villain of the story, the ferret-like man with the strange accent, Maxim Tassan, who is really a secret agent for the Communist International. Okay, so a lot of things happen in the novel, including romance, party scenes, labor agitation, protest, and discussions of the differences between Stalinists, Trotskyites, communists, socialists, fascists. But it all revolves around which group will become the official Aid to Ethiopia organization. Will it be the all-black Hands to Ethiopia, presided by Pablo Peixoto, or the White Friends of Ethiopia, ran by Maxim Tassan, secretly ran? And the novel mercilessly exposes the many nefarious ways in which Tassan and those who support him undermine black self-determination and ceaselessly try to dismantle their efforts and strip them of their status. By the end of the novel, a string of false publicity forces Pablo Peixoto to step down from his role as president of the Hands to Ethiopia. Professor Kwase is evicted from the home out of which he used to hold free classes for local students and where he kept his prized possession of African artifacts. And many other characters are fired from their posts. Moreover, the Ethiopian envoy Alamaya is coerced into shifting his support away from the Hands to Ethiopia over to the White Friends when the one document that proved his status as an official envoy of Ethiopia, a letter from Emperor Haile Selassie himself, is stolen at a party. Actually, two things happen. The letter is stolen, and shortly thereafter, newspapers start circulating a story that Emperor Selassie has reportedly never sent an envoy to the United States to speak on his behalf. Since the letter was the only thing that could refute these new media reports, and since he no longer has it, the Hands to Ethiopia organization is disgraced, and subsequently Alamaya has his best hope now remains to raise funds for Ethiopia is now the White Friends, even though all the sympathetic characters of the novel know that Tassan's behind the theft and the emperor's statement. Amidst all this deception, which I'd like to underscore revolves around documents like an imperial letter and newspaper headlines, printed media, comes the hoax at the heart of the novel. This involves the sudden appearance, once Alamaya has moved over to the White Friends, of Princess Benebe Zarihana of Ethiopia. All decked out in exotic, quote, Ethiopian attire and performing as a pantomime and singer, she quickly becomes the toast of the town and helps to generate a lot of funds for the White Friends. To give you a taste of the novel and of McKay's wonderful flair for satire, I just want to review a bit of the passage from the princess's arrival on the scene. The Princess Benebe Zarihana was heralded as a messenger of hope and faith from Ethiopia. She was also an amateur pantomimist who had graciously condescended to give a few special performances for the benefit of Ethiopia. Princess Benebe Zarihana was identified as a direct descendant of Falasha, Black Jewish, Queen Judith, who ascended the throne of Ethiopia in the year 937 and reigned for 40 years. And by the way, McKay does this all the time. He inserts history lessons about African history, African-American trivia all the time in the novel, kind of educating us. All right, back to the novel. The princess had arrived under the sponsorship of the Friends of Ethiopia. Unlike the coming of Lish Alamaya, Harlem had no part in the glory of welcoming the princess. most of the upper strata of Haarlemites were partial to the way in which the visit of the Princess Benebe was handled. The fiasco of Liege Alamaya's spectacular debut in Haarlem was fresh and irritating to their thoughts. They considered it more appropriate to the dignity of Ethiopia as a nation that the princess should be launched from downtown. Downtown was the seat of wealth and power. Haarlem had little to offer besides excitement. Haarlemites who desired to see her could go downtown, as they usually did, to see any celebrated Afro-American star resplendent in Aryan setting. Her first appearance at the city casino was a successful affair socially and financially. Liege Alamaya was her interpreter, as Princess Benebe did not speak English. And I'm continuing here. Arrayed in striking rich costumes, the princess executed the following striking series of tableaux of the women of Ethiopia. A queen of Ethiopian coronation robes, Ethiopian woman in a bazaar, Ethiopian woman in a negligee, Ethiopian noblewoman in her boudoir, Ethiopian woman after the visit of the hairdresser, Ethiopian woman in bridal costume, Ethiopian bride reclining in her tent, Ethiopian equestrienne, Ethiopian woman arrayed for the battlefront, Ethiopian woman and child. At the end of the pantomime, Princess Benebe sang a plaintive Ethiopian song. Her voice was not great, but it was pleasingly rarely modulated and effective. It might have made its mark in a small concert room. The distinguished audience threw off its dignity and generous applause of the Princess of Ethiopia. By its attitude, one could gauge the degree of sympathy they had for the beleaguered Ethiopian nation. There were present important personages in social, professional, and professional life. Their presence there was as much a protest against ruthless aggression as it was an appreciation of an unusual talent among an obscure African people. The reviews of her tableau were favorable. One enthusiast marveled at the nobility inherent in her consummate African dignity, the indefinable artistry manifested in every shade of her movement. All right, that's McKay. The joke here is that Princess Benebe is actually Harlem-born Gloria Kendall. This is confirmed late in the novel when Seraphine Peixoto, the daughter of the ex-president of the Hands to Ethiopia, finds a secret cache of documents inside the villain Maxim Tassan's apartment. When Seraphine opens the safe, she discovers a lot of canceled checks, many letters, and various business papers fastened together with clips, as well as a large, thick envelope marked Ethiopia, containing half a dozen photographs of Princess Benebe in different costumes and poses, and 4 of Gloria Kendall. Seraphine immediately realizes that Benebe and Kendall are the same person. Hard to believe such an elaborate trick, she thinks, but the evidence was right here. On the back of one of the photographs, she finds a note reading, "This costume is Persian, unsuitable," in Alamaya's handwriting. So, sifting further into the Ethiopia envelope, she finds Alamaya's stolen imperial letter. And now the extent of Tassan's frame-up is finally revealed. Not only is Tassan responsible for the fall of her father's organization, but he's manipulated Alamaya and along with the princess deception and using him as a consultant for the costumes. What I want to stress here is both the co-opting of a black intellectual and how McKay, as a novelist, opts to expose the degrees of factual deceit the white communists have perpetrated through Seraphine's unearthing of archival evidence. Yet that evidence is at once authentic and fabricated, exactly like the deracinated lumps of material related to McKay we found in the Samuel Roth papers. Here's the kicker, though. Even Alamaya's imperial letter, here retrieved by Seraphine and later brought back to the Ethiopian, proves problematic as an authentic document. Though the narrative had made the letter, quote, the most authentic thing of all, it turns out to be not altogether genuine, as Alamaya says. At the end of the novel, after Ethiopia has been defeated and an interest in his homeland has disappeared from the sidewalks of Harlem, Alamaya finally reveals the true provenance of the letter. The document is a remnant of the Pan-African movement, written at the height of the Harlem Renaissance, when the government of Ethiopia was convinced by, quote, prominent Africans, Haitians, Cubans, Afro-Americans, and others, in the idea of sending a mission to America. Although the plan was abandoned just before it was put into execution, Alamaya eventually got hold of the letter that was meant for one of the originally designated members of the postponed mission. As Alamaya humorously explains, so few people can read official Amharic language of Ethiopia, he decides that it might still work 12 years later, after it had been issued. In other words, through an undisclosed deceit, he appropriates the document and belatedly re-endows it with its primary value by forcing it back into a new life cycle, or perhaps the life cycle it was always meant to have. What's important for me here, too, is the delay, the 12-year delay in making use of the document, and the ability on the part of a black intellectual to remain authentic to his goals and his true purpose while simultaneously being disingenuous. This is especially important because Maxim Tassin and Lijah Alamaya are not the only ones who have been deceiving the reader. McKay has been altering the facts. You see, in real life, the real man who presented a fake Ethiopian princess to Harlem was not a commenter and secret agent, but a former baseball star turned PR man named Chappie Gardner. There he is on the left there. Gardner, referred to as the Black P.T. Barnum in the FWP reels, was an original member of McKay's Negro Writers Guild. He worked as an arts critic for Pittsburgh Courier after spending his youth on the black sports scene. The writers of the FWP composed a few portraits of Gardner and traced the arrival as well as the subsequent exposure of Princess Heshla Tamanya in the local newspapers. There she is. The almanac, the FWP's almanac for New Yorkers in 1938, entry for July 20th reads, Harlemites chuckled this day in 1935 when it was learned that Chappie Gardner, Negro press agent, had hoaxed the entire metropolitan press with his story of an Ethiopian princess. What does the making the hoax of the handiwork of a communist secret agent rather than that of a black entrepreneur provide McKay? As a novelist, McKay is now able to lend credence to much of what he had denounced about the Communist Party in his previous book, Harlem Negro Metropolis, where he writes, communists can stage some of the most spectacular affairs and can bring obscure Negroes into the spotlight to speak in splendid halls before huge audiences. The move might not be genuine, to quote Alamaya, but it becomes the best means of providing authentic reality of life, as he saw it, and points to an archival morality where factual evidence is shown to always be manipulated, and thereby takes advantage, as Ralph Ellison says, of the novel's capacity for telling the truth while actually telling a lie. Alamaya's use of the imperial letter is guided by his own sense of morality regarding group unity, and McKay's remix of the FWP archive is similarly guided by his ultimate purpose to promote autonomous black solidarity. It is in this sense that McKay's archival aesthetic is a hidden ethic. In order to counter white communist fantasy, then, late McKay comes up with his own. Just weeks before starting to write Amiable, McKay had attacked the communists in The New Leader because they manipulated real issues to promote their propaganda, quote. And years after seeing the many ways in which media constantly manipulate everyone's sense of reality, he returns to his role as a novelist in order to enact his own revisionist retaliation, empowering himself to manipulate the issues through a mix of fiction or history or both. In reconstituting, reactivating, reclassifying, rewriting his own archive, McKay thus appropriates for himself and in the service of his community the strategies usually reserved for institutional or imperial governance. Doing so unearths a hidden past in order to construct a new kind of future. For all these reasons and more, it is truly tragic that Amiable was not published the year it was written, in 1941, just a year after Richard Wright's Native Son, as it might have solidified McKay's status as one of the foremost prose writers of his day and clarified his dedication to his own group. In a letter to McKay from June 1941, at a time when he still thought the novel would be published by E.P. Dutton, his former FWP colleague, Simon Williamson, writes, I am glad that your publisher and the critic liked your manuscript. It comes at an opportune time of social change, development, and disillusion for the Negro, for all the peoples of the world. In the meantime, all we can do is organize, educate, and reorient the lives of our people into channels of self-respect, economic improvement, and social and cultural development. They must be given a determination to overcome obstacles and continue to survive. In so many words, the black man must create his world out of the debris and mess the white peoples are making of the present. Reading Williamson's letter today feels tragically timely, and the novel, though 75 years late, nevertheless seems to come at an opportune time. Amiable with Big Teeth is a late novel in more ways than one. It's both from McKay's late phase, what we might call his late style, but it also comes to us late, much later than its initial life cycle was ever devised or designed. Yet herein lies the essence of the archival. For what is the archival but a pastness to come, un passé à venir, a belated form of timeliness? With each new reader, the novel undertakes a new life cycle. Perhaps not what McKay had in mind, but I hope a most welcome rebirth nonetheless. Thanks.
Great job, Jean-Christophe. Why wasn't the book published? And how could, McKay's papers are some at the Beinecke, but elsewhere, the Schomburg, how could there not be a reference to this somewhere, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was one of the things that kept perplexing us, too.
Right.
We were researching. But there's something that we quote in the introduction where McKay writes to Catherine Latimer, who was at the time the librarian at the Schomburg, and he says, I want to send you some more of my manuscripts and materials, but I have to let you know that sometimes I make the mistake of throwing out valuable items in the trash, like
Right.
manuscripts and
Right.
contracts. Like
Right.
he literally says that.
Right.
Well, I mean, for us today, it's like hard to think about because of how much we value everything, every little scrap he may have written on. But he was constantly moving, kind of vagabond poet, as he calls it. And he seems to always kind of be looking ahead to the next project. He's also someone who burned his first attempt at a novel, Color Scheme. He just set fire to it. So he,
But what about the papers of E.P. Dutton?
yeah. So the thing with most publishers, and E.P. Dutton is not an exception, is that publishers rarely, if ever, keep materials related to rejected manuscripts. It just gets thrown out. We know that he kept being paid till after Harlem Negro Panthropoulos, who also published, that E.P. Dutton published. So he was in, but there's no trace of the contract, and there's no letter explaining why. There's this kind of gap between 1941 and 42 where McKay also, I should say, becomes severely ill, and he has to be hospitalized. And there's a gap between his correspondence with Max Eastman, who was his closest correspondent while composing Amiable with Big Teeth. And in 1942, suddenly there's a letter saying, I know it's been over a year since I last wrote to you, and a lot's happened since then. And in that gap, there's the rejection from Dutton, the illness, and somehow, and also that contract with Roth. The first evidence we have between McKay and Roth is from September 41, and it's a copy of Roth's book of poems, Europe, a Book for America. That's the title. That's at the Beinecke, and it's inscribed to McKay by Roth. That's the first kind of date that we have for their contact. But who knows why it was rejected by Dutton? I mean, it may have felt too incendiary at the time, way too satirical, too many attacks.
Well, so this is just how many months before Pearl Harbor, right? A whole big thing intervenes there called World War II, which changes the nature of things. But why do you, it occurred to me that a great thesis, certainly a great essay, and maybe even a great thesis, I'm not at war with my graduate students, but I'm trying to push them, instead of everybody writing but one more reading of Zora Hurston or something about hip-hop, to go back to the archives, because there's gold in the archives. I keep telling these people, you could be famous. You just have to, you'll go back and you're going to find things. But a study of mistaken African identity, or the mask of Africa, the masquerade. Yeah. There are a lot of these incidents. I mean, I remember my family, first of all, politically incorrect, I don't care. My family loved Amos and Andy on television. And one of the most beloved of all the episodes was the Punjab of Javapur, when Andy pretends to be a potentate, from the East, right, and very rich and blah, blah, blah. But there must be a lot of these. I don't know if that often the TV show is just recapitulating things that are in the long-running radio program, and I haven't looked to see. But there are a lot of these examples of the Ethiopian princess or whatever. but I don't think anyone's actually done a study of them, which would be quite fascinating. Yeah, I mean, every African I ever met when I was an undergraduate, and certainly when I went to England, was a prince, right? But this African prince thing goes back to the slave narratives. James Granius saw as a subtitle of the first slave narrative is by an African prince. Well, who knows the Negro was a prince? Probably not. If he's a prince, he wouldn't have been a slave. But anyway, this pretending to be African and pretending to be royal, both, are a leitmotif going back to the 18th century.
That's true. And there's, I know that Robert Hill has written about imposters, black imposters, in really interesting ways. And that absolutely is something that is kind of this thread. And George Schuyler, who at the same time was also writing these Ethiopian-inspired stories, like Black, that was collected by Hill in Black Empire.
Right.
Often kind of takes, he also bases a character on Caspar Holstein. He calls him Oscar Holcomb. It's very close. And so they're kind of tapping into that same history and kind of making these imposters kind of heroes, or kind of appropriating from themselves methods that they've seen, people in power using all the time. And there's also Ada Ferrer has written a book called, I can't remember, but it's about a guy who pretends to be Henri Christophe, and he goes to San Domingo, and he pretends to be this guy in order to get support and money for Haiti. And he has this fake letter proving that he is Henri Christophe. And in fact, he isn't just like Lige Alamaya kind of has this fake letter, or rather this letter that is outdated.
Is that in her most recent book?
Yes.
On Cuba and Haiti. It's a brilliant book.
It's an anecdote from that book.
So why are you so hard on him for, he's a novelist. He couldn't take this thing that happened and make it communist in a novel.
Absolutely.
But you used very harsh terms.
You think?
Yeah, well, you did. You said that I can't remember exactly, but it was very strong.
Well, what's fascinating to me is the diligence and the pride that he took in factual accuracy as a journalist and in writing Harlem Negro Metropolis, the book he writes just before Amiable. He's so adamant about making sure he's done his proper research and has all the facts correct.
But that's nonfiction.
Sure, it's nonfiction. But and that's the province that he has as a novelist. But I'm interested in that move, in the sense that it was an avenue for him to try to create a kind of a sense of black unity, and he thought that maybe factual accuracy was the way to do it. Nobody wanted to hear what he had to say. And so he thought, maybe I should just go back to my abilities as a troubadour, right, as a poet, and do it that way. And another thing that happens is that as we were reading the letters, is that he keeps writing things like, he keeps writing Simon Williamson, the guy I just quoted at the end, and he says, can you send me those clippings again? I want to dovetail the Spanish Civil War into my novel, but I want to be certain about the facts. He's always asking about, I want to be certain about the facts, and yet when he's composing the novel, he creates these kind of core deceptions. But yes, that's the province of the imaginative and the literary. But at the same time, I think it's an interesting relation to the kind of a paranoid relation that he had with media and manipulation of facts. He was surveilled by the FBI all the time, as like FBI's by Bill Maxwell, which is recent book kind of talks about. So he wasn't just paranoid for being paranoid. He was right. They were looking. They were like after him. So.
Good. Questions, comments? Let's hear from Ethiopia. The Queen of Abyssinia would like to ask a question. Do we have more than one Queen of Abyssinia in this room?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that amazingly rich talk. I guess I have two questions, and one might be harder to answer, but as you go forward with this work, one of the things that strikes me about McKay and the hoaxes and the novels, right, is the ways in which this dovetails with the Derg, Ethiopia's communist regime that takes over, and how they perpetuate a series of fictions about the empire. And so if you're thinking about the afterlife of this novel, what McKay is describing in the 1930s in this sort of tension with communism takes place in a really interesting way in Ethiopia in the 1970s and 80s in the recreation. I guess
Ethiopia of the 70s?
Yeah, so the revolution takes place in 74, and Mengistu eventually emerges, but it's a Marxist regime that's all about the creation of new archives and fictions and the literal burying of bodies. So that's more of a comment. My question has to do with the narrative of women in this, right? The idea that it's a princess, that you can recreate with a princess, but you can't maybe recreate with a prince. And what made me think of this is the narrative that you see in America of the Cherokee grandmother. It's always a Cherokee grandmother and she's always a princess. Or the fact that the example that you have from 1935 is a woman being portrayed as a princess. Is that because there was a recognition that the most recent empress of Ethiopia had been an empress, and so there's an idea of femininity and power that fits this narrative? What is it? Why is it fake princesses instead of fake princes exclusively?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I mean, one way to think about it is quantitatively, there were more princesses than princes, so they might have been more believable to present an Ethiopian princess. Like in his papers at the Beinecke, McKay has a bunch of clippings of photos of various sisters of Haile Selassie and other princesses, like, what's her name? Can't remember her name, but there's quite a few photos, and there seem to be more of them. So it seems that it would be more believable to for a guy like Chappie Gardner to kind of present an Ethiopian princess and go that way in order to, as a means of creating funds, right, for the cause of Ethiopia. I do find it interesting that in the novel, it's Seraphine. It's one of the leading female characters who finds the crucial evidence, to kind of rectify the problem of what's been happening and to kind of bring back the dignity to the characters. So I think that the empowerment of that character is necessary, because in other scenes he kind of writes her in a way that she's kind of swindled into marrying this kind of moron guy, Andy Nordling he's called, and that kind of thing. But it's mostly a novel populated by male figures, but Seraphine does kind of emerge at that end to give that. But I'm not sure why other than maybe practical reasons, or that's what I'm thinking of right now.
JC, thank you so much for this. We had the good fortune of having the chance to speak about this in your research at dinner, yet hearing it again is just still as mind-blowing to me. So thanks. A few observations and then a question. So for the record, The Shining is the scariest film I've ever seen to this day. But I've never read the book, so it was interesting to hear you present that scene, and I really just got that sense of going over what are literally called dead objects, these just resting archives, what that could do in terms of the narrative of that book, the terror of him being infected by these old ideas, you might say, and these concerns and preoccupations. The other was that someone has got to do a movie about Samuel Roth with J.K. Simmons, the sadistic band leader from Whiplash, in the lead role. I just had that thought looking at his picture, and what an incredible story. Did you keep the film rights to Amiable, or does Penguin have them?
The McKay estate owns all the
McKay estate has all of that. That makes sense. Why did he write the book? I'm as a writer who has lived in Harlem, I had the sense of a guy going about his business every day, especially having written the first book about Negro Metropolis, and saying, this stuff is so bugged, someone should write a novel about it. Just like all the people you meet and the things that you see and what life is like there. Just saying, the stuff that I see every day in Harlem is so crazy that someone should just write a book about it.
Why don't you write a book about it?
No, I'm saying that's what I imagine him thinking as he's walking around as a Harlem writer, just saying, man, and then saying, why don't I do it? I've already done it. I've got the facts, the material. Does he ever say, or did you ever come across a reason why he did this book, why he wanted to do Amiable? What was the the inception for it?
But remember, he had already done another novel about Harlem in the 20s.
Which one was that? I know he did a number of.
Harlem.
Yeah, Home to Harlem, and it was very controversial. In fact, one of the things I used to teach was that Marcus Garvey reviewed it, Du Bois reviewed it, and Alain Locke reviewed it. They all hated it, but for different reasons.
Langston Hughes liked it, though.
Langston.
Yeah, he liked it.
Yeah, but he was the young Turk.
Yeah.
But the old guys all hated it because they thought it was disgusting, low life. He's an expert, he can tell you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he called it the underworld of Harlem.
Right.
And
Home to Harlem or
Home
Amiable?
to Harlem, yeah, he said he was depicting the underworld of Harlem because it had numbers runners, prostitutes, drinking,
Dope.
jazz scenes, as opposed to, lawyers or doctors, which were more often the protagonists to be found in
Who's the president?
Jake Brown. Yeah.
Yeah, Jake Brown's the president. You gotta read it, it's a short,
Sounds fascinating.
but it's one of the most famous novels of the Harlem Renaissance.
Right.
Who wrote The Black Imposter?
I heard the title, but I've not read it.
Robert Hill.
Okay, great.
Does he ever say about what got him started with Amiable, though? Like, this is the
Well-
thing that made me want to write this book, or?
Well, he comes back after 12 years spent abroad in 1934 to the United States. And he comes back wanting to write a novel or fiction based on his experiences abroad. One of the things that had struck him the most abroad was this idea of group solidarity. And being able to live in North Africa, kind of luxuriating in the presence of Africans and just being himself, all of that allowed him to kind of see the strength in group unity, in developing their own institutions, their own books, their own press, their own everything for themselves. And he wanted to kind of come back to the United States and kind of give that same sense of solidarity. But he was kind of wavering as to what best means to do that. He started by trying to think to do a novel. He ended up writing his memoir, A Long Way From Home, in 1937. He ended up then writing a book of nonfiction. And then, again, it's like the last-ditch attempt to kind of create this thing because no one was kind of listening to him. The Harlem Negro Metropolis did not sell well at all. He called it a conspiracy of silence in the press against him. And maybe he thought maybe a novel will finally be able to kind of expose what's going on and the ways in which we're being abused and used and by all these different kinds of forces. I mean, for him, the Communist International had become more nefarious than he says. The communist fascism is more harmful than Nazi fascism. So it was really something that he felt would perhaps be best exposed in a novel because no one was listening to him in his other venues. He was really kind of being isolated from a lot of different angles at this point.
Was that an emphasis or an angle of Negro Metropolis, the Communist Party, or?
Oh yeah, Bill Maxwell calls it a party-bashing Baedeker.
He becomes a devout Roman Catholic, man.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's what I heard shortly before he dies.
Well, because he becomes severely ill, and it's a group it's a Catholic group who find him and tend to him and care for him, and eventually allow him to move to Chicago, where he worked for the Catholic Youth Organization in Chicago for the rest of his life.
Wow.
Can I just ask a question about, thinking about McKay as a modernist in light of the motives for writing and publication. I mean, the relationship that he has to the marketplace is very ambivalent, and he places a premium on his freedom as an artist. So I think, from that perspective, he may have not intended it for publication. For now, this idea that a modernist writer writes for future generations. But I was wondering, also what his what his economic situation was. Was he desperate to publish?
Completely desperate.
Poor.
Yeah.
He could have published it in 2 seconds.
Okay.
Well, he took that contract with Roth, and as I said, the check bounced, and he was really upset.
Yeah. But at the same time, he deliberately incorporates politics into this work in a way that
Is not going to help.
Sell.
That's
Yeah.
McKay, though. He's fearless.
Yeah.
He's one of the bravest men, that I've come across in my research, in the sense
No,
that.
but being anti-communist would have
Well, I mean, it made him a lot of enemies. I mean, because at the time,
Communists were not running Wall Street, right?
No.
New York Publishing Company.
but all of his kind of, many of the kind of, I don't know, circuits of patronage and like, you know, Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, who were with him on the FWP, were in their communist phase at that moment. He was 10 years ahead of them in terms of disillusionment with the party. And so that created this kind of break in solidarity that he lived as really tragic.
No, but by 41, Wright had broken with the party.
By 41,
I think
when the God that
the guy
failed,
that failed,
it,
isn't that 42?
43 or yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's about, but when they were on the years together, 36 to 39, that's what, so in 1937 when his memoir comes out, and he really kind of mocks Alain Locke.
Right.
Mistake. And then Richard Wright tells Alain Locke, you know, why don't you write a review, you know, saying how bad McKay is and how this book is, and he calls him a spiritual truant. Right. Spiritual truancy.
Was that when Wright was editing not the new leader, but the...
That was just before Uncle Tom's Children.
Right. So where does Locke publish the review? You said that Wright
Yes.
asked Locke to publish the review,
Yes.
but
Spiritual truancy. Do you remember where it is?
but Richard Wright is editing not the New Left review, the New Leader, or remember it, and he publishes Ellison's review of. Yeah, I just wondered if
the
Locke.
BC?
Yeah, if Locke is publishing the review in the journal that Richard Wright is editing. Do you
I think
remember?
so.
Yeah, it's the New Leader or the new something. I can't remember.
Yeah, I can't remember.
New masses.
New Masses. Thank you, Cordell. Thank you very much. Professor West.
Well, no, my dear brother has a question first.
Okay,
Oh, thanks, Doc.
Joshua.
Yeah, it was a beautiful talk, Jean-Christophe.
Thank you.
You started off by bringing us this adjacency between the afterlife of publications and the afterlife of slavery, right? So my question was essentially, and you also invoke Kevin Young, right, who in his book, The Gray Album, has this figure of the
Gray
shadow book. So both the book in the African-American aesthetic tradition that is not written, but also you seem to be talking about books that are sort of obscured from the archive, right? And so
Well, the three categories that Young uses.
yeah, please. Yeah, and so I'm thinking about that figure alongside the ethics and politics, which seem to haunt your talk, right? So sort of McKay wanting to keep politics out of it, but also his ethical decisions. And how do you understand the ethics and politics of your own archival work then, right? So I'm thinking both about Alice Walker and Hurston, but also more recently someone like Terrence Hayes, right, with Christopher Gilbert, and this work of essentially resuscitating these shadow books, right, that have been obscured for the archive. And for you, is that an ethic of care? Is that a politics of care? How are you situating it for yourself?
Yeah, that's something that I've thought about a lot, or that the idea that like do all books need to come out, or even sometimes these thoughts come to me when reading correspondence in archives. They're always letters are never, when you read a letter in an archive, you're like committing a felony, right? You're reading someone else's mail, like you're not supposed to do that. And I always think of that, and there's that kind of intimacy that happens that is seductive, but also you have to be wary of it in the sense that you read something, you feel so close to an author suddenly, or to the writer, because it seems so immediate. There you are reading the thoughts that they had at that moment, and there's that kind of immediate contact. Now, is that something that you keep for yourself? Is something that you ruminate on? Is that something that's supposed to be publicly exposed? Stephen Best talks about in relation to the archive. He says that we have to be wary of what we might call targets of recovery. I think the word target, that aggressivity of it, right? Like that do we target things for recovery, like in this militaristic sense almost, like we target it for it to come out for some of the, what is the, I mean, of course, we would never have published a novel if the estate hadn't agreed to it. The intellectual property belongs to the heirs, but yeah, it's something I think about. I mean, in terms of, huh? And I've had the privilege of being able to also release the previously unpublished French manuscripts of Jack Kerouac, who's French-Canadian. I'm French-Canadian, so to me that was this kind of very personal affair. But I did, wonder, like, were these books that were, I mean, what is the kind of when you release something in the present, that delay that happens, that kind of archival, the archive is something that has, like I said, a pastness to come. So if it's not going to be used for posterity, then it might as well kind of remain in oblivion. But in a way, I mean, it's something that I think should be taken with care and case-by-case basis, right? And part of why I immediately knew I wanted to work with Professor Edwards, for instance, was that I knew he was way more prepared than I was at that time to handle this and to contextualize it properly.
And he loves the archive.
And he loves the archive, of course. But that, so in the sense that it wasn't about hoarding the document for personal gain, but rather what is the best thing for this manuscript, for it to kind of perhaps have a rebirth, to see the light of day, a novel that waited so long to come out.
But it took a struggle to cut this loose. And he can tell you about that over dinner. Finally.
Yeah, no, I just want to thank you for a superb presentation. No, definitely. But to what degree is this novel a kind of conversion novel, or at least the early stages of conversion? Because, I mean, like the great Marcus Garvey, named after Marcus Aurelius, he ended up a Catholic too.
Yeah.
Claude McKay is losing a certain kind of quasi-religion because he was so deeply invested intellectually, existentially, in the left project. He's the leading left intellectual. In the 20s, he's in the Soviet Union for 6 months, and so forth and so on. So he's invested, quasi-religion that he's given up. So he's got a crisis of faith in a certain sense. Then we get this anti-communist novel. So the FBI is no longer on him. Maxwell's work with the domestic intelligence unit of the FBI, with William Sullivan keeping track of all these Negro writers, going back to the press and making sure they rewrite the book so that it's not incendiary. If it's incendiary, they won't publish it. That's true for Ralph Ellison. That's true for Claude, all the way back, right? So that, what is the role of his emerging Catholicism? And what is the treatment of religion in this text, given the fact that he is now being converted in a religious direction, given his deep secular, agnostic, atheistic years, where he was actually, in some ways, more creative?
And you have to answer it in 60 seconds.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, one thing I'll say is that he hadn't quite begun the conversion yet. He had to, kind of like that deathbed, what do we call it, like Don Quixote, deathbed repentance, right? He's so ill, and then suddenly, like, yes, I embrace God. But it wasn't quite like that. But it took a long time for him to finally decide to get baptized. And that happened after 43, and with his work in the Catholic Friendship House, Catholic Friendship House. And then, but there is a tremendous amount of conversion, yes, inside him in terms of that long process of re-education against, he was in the throne room of the Kremlin, in Moscow, speaking as the unofficial, American Negro, quote unquote. And yet years later, he's kind of suddenly telling everybody that the nefarious aspects of the Communist Party, which is why a lot of the young black intellectuals really feared him, because he was saying something completely different than what they were being kind of pushed towards, but they also knew he had been there. He was the guy who had been there. So what he was saying was really disturbing. But I think, through just the diligence of his research. He was, like I said in the novel, he inserts so many history lessons. He even has an African-American character, Professor Kwasi, tell the Ethiopian things about his own nation that he didn't know about. And that kind of push toward education as a way to get you to a self-understanding of peoples of African descent is really at the heart of that conversion, perhaps.
Jean-Christophe, thank you.